The deed was in his hands before he understood what it meant, and the moment he did, Elijah Donovan felt the ground shift beneath his boots like the earth itself had turned traitor. It was a Tuesday in late October of 1882, the kind of raw, iron-gray afternoon that settled over the Colorado Territory like a wool blanket soaked through with rain. Elijah had been sorting through the stack of land, records his attorney. A pinched little man named Hadley from Pueblo had sent over in a leather satchel. He had been expecting routine documents, survey confirmations, tax notices, the dull paperwork that came with owning 4,000 acres of prime grazing land along the Purgatoire River. What he had not been expecting was a folded piece of parchment, older than the rest, its edges soft with age, its ink faded but completely legible, tucked between two county assessments like someone had slid it there deliberately and hoped it would never be found. Atwood Land Grant, established 1871, 1,200 acres, western boundary the Purgatoire River, eastern boundary Mesa Ridge. Holder of record Thomas Atwood, and upon his death, sole heir Annie Atwood. His chest went cold. He read it again, then a third time. The acreage described in that document was not some distant corner of the territory. It was the very heart of his ranch, the best pasture land, the section that ran alongside the river where the water never dried up even in the worst drought years, the section he had built his entire cattle operation around, the section he had paid good money for, or believed he had, 6 years ago when he purchased the Donovan spread from the estate of a man named Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch, it now appeared, had sold him land that was not entirely his to sell. Elijah set the deed down on the table very carefully, the way a man sets down a loaded gun he has just found pointed at himself. Someone had buried this document. Someone had deliberately hidden it, folded it into the county records where a careless man would never have noticed it, where it would have gone on being invisible for another decade or two while the land stayed in Elijah's name, and the rightful heir, Annie Atwood, whoever she was, remained ignorant of what she had lost. And now he held the proof of that theft in his own 2 hands. The question that rose in him was not whether he would do the right thing. That question never even formed itself, because Elijah Donovan was not the kind of man who needed to debate his own conscience. The question that rose in him was simpler and far more complicated at the same time. Who was Annie Atwood? And did she even know she existed in these records at all? He was still sitting there an hour later, the lamp burning low, the deed spread open on the table in front of him, when he made his decision. He would find her. What happened next was not something Elijah could have predicted if he had been given all the time in the world and 1,000 guesses to work with. Because Annie Atwood, as it turned out, was not some distant and abstract legal claimant living quietly in a city back east. Annie Atwood was already in Red Haven, the small Colorado Territory town 15 miles from his ranch. She had arrived 3 days ago on the southbound stage from Denver, carrying 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, a surveying map her dead father had sent her from his deathbed, and an absolute iron determination to find out what had become of her inheritance. She had, in fact, already asked questions of the wrong people. And those wrong people had already sent word to a man named Corbin Lyle, who had been Gerald Fitch's business partner, and who now owned the Red Haven Bank, and who had very good reasons of his own to ensure that Annie Atwood never found that deed. But none of that had happened yet, in the chronology of things that Elijah Donovan understood, when he rode into Red Haven the following morning and walked into the county land office on the main street to ask the registrar whether there was any record of an Atwood land claim in the territory. The registrar, a slow-moving man named Buell who wore the same brown vest every day of his working life, looked at Elijah with an expression of mild alarm and said that he could not discuss private records without proper cause. Elijah placed the deed on the counter between them. Buell looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Elijah. Then he looked at the deed again. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It was buried in my land packet," Elijah said. Sent from your office according to the seal on the satchel. Buell's face went the color of old wax. That document, he said carefully, was filed as inactive in 1876. On what basis? I would need to review the on what basis, Elijah said again, his voice quiet and completely steady. Was a legal land grant filed as inactive? Buell shuffled papers for several minutes, retreating into the back room, returning with a ledger that he opened with hands that were not entirely still. He found the entry. He read it. He read it a second time. It appears, he said, that a notice of abandonment was filed in April of 1876, claiming that the original grantee, Thomas Atwood, had vacated the land without maintaining improvements and that his heir had made no claim. Thomas Atwood died in March of 1876, Elijah said. I confirmed that before I came here this morning. His daughter would have been 17 years old, who filed the abandonment notice. Another long pause. Buell turned the ledger slightly, then turned it back as though he could change what it said by repositioning it. Gerald Fitch, he said. Elijah straightened up. The pieces of it were assembling themselves in his mind with a kind of grim, ugly clarity. Gerald Fitch had filed a fraudulent abandonment notice 1 month after Thomas Atwood's death, before the man's 17-year-old daughter could be located or notified, and then had sold the land, the entire 4,000 acres, including the 1,200 that were never legally his, to Elijah Donovan 2 years later for a sum of money that had seemed, at the time, like a fair price for legitimate property. Gerald Fitch had been dead for 4 years. There was no recovering anything from him. But Annie Atwood was alive, and she was owed 1,200 acres of the best land along the Purgatoire River. Elijah was walking out of the land office into the pale October sunlight when he nearly collided with a woman coming up the wooden steps from the opposite direction. He caught her by the arm to steady her, and she stepped back and looked up at him with a pair of dark brown eyes that were sharp and watchful and not remotely afraid, and said, "I beg your pardon," in a voice that was precise and composed and carried just a suggestion of something held very firmly in check. She was, he estimated, in her middle 20s. She had dark hair pinned neatly under a practical felt hat, and she was wearing a dark green traveling coat that had seen considerable use, and she carried a leather document case under one arm like a woman who understood that the things in it mattered. "My fault entirely," Elijah said. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said, and made to move past him. "Are you Annie Atwood?" he asked. She stopped. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Not fear exactly, but a very rapid and very careful recalibration. The way a person looks when they have been keeping a secret, and someone has just said something that might mean the secret is no longer secret. "Who is asking?" She said, "My name is Elijah Donovan," he said. "I own, or believed I owned, the Donovan Ranch on the Purgatoire. I have something that belongs to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved a loose strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she did not reach up to push it away because she was too busy watching his face. "You found it," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yesterday evening," he said, "in a packet of land records." Something shifted in her expression then, something complex and difficult to name, relief and suspicion in equal measure, tangled up with something that might have been a very old grief. "You could have burned it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" "Because it's yours," he said simply. She studied him for another long moment, as though measuring the distance between what a man said and what a man meant and finding the gap either acceptable or absent. Then she said, "Mr. Donovan, I think we need to talk." They went across the street to the dining room of the Red Haven Hotel, which was the most respectable establishment available at that hour, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and ordered coffee. And Annie Atwood laid the history of her father's land out in front of him with the kind of careful, systematic precision that told him she had been assembling this story for a very long time. Thomas Atwood had come to Colorado Territory in 1869, 2 years before the land grant, as part of a small group of settlers who had believed, not unreasonably, that the territory offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. He had been a surveyor by training, which was why the grant documentation was so unusually precise. Thomas had surveyed his own claim and filed it correctly, in full, with accurate measurements and boundaries. He had built a house and started improving the land over the following years, running a modest cattle operation and growing winter wheat in the lower pastures. He had also, in those same years, taken on a business arrangement with Gerald Fitch that had seemed, at the time, like a partnership between men of goodwill. Fitch had provided capital. Thomas had provided land access and labor. The agreement was verbal, which was, Annie said, her father's greatest and most costly mistake. By 1875, Thomas Atwood was ill. By early 1876, he was dying. He sent a letter to Annie, who had been living with her maternal aunt in Kansas City since her mother's death in 1873, telling her about the land grant and directing her to come to Colorado to claim it as his heir. The letter had taken 11 days to arrive. Annie had made arrangements and set out within a week of receiving it. She had arrived in Pueblo to find that her father had died 2 days before her stage reached the city. "I was 17, she said. "I had almost no money, no legal counsel, and no way to make the journey to the land itself, which was another 60 miles from Pueblo. I wrote to the county land office requesting confirmation of the grant and received a letter back stating that the property had been determined abandoned and was under dispute. They cited a notice filed by Gerald Fitch. "You should have had legal recourse," Elijah said. "I tried," she said, and her voice was even but her hands around her coffee cup were slightly too tight. "I went to an attorney in Pueblo who took one look at a 17-year-old girl with no money and informed me that pursuing a land dispute against an established businessman was not an endeavor he could assist with. I went to a second attorney who told me the same thing. I went back to Kansas City and worked for 6 years and saved what I could and found an attorney there, finally, who told me that if I could locate the original grant documentation, I might have grounds to reopen the claim." "Your father's copy," Elijah said. "He sent it to me in a second letter," she said. "His attorney in Pueblo held it for me, a different attorney from the ones I had approached, a man named Warren who apparently actually had a conscience. He passed it to me through his estate when he died last year, with a note saying my father had given it to him for safekeeping and that he was sorry he had not done more." She opened the document case and showed him the copy. It was a near-perfect match to the deed he had found. Same measurements, same boundaries, same signatures, same notary seal. "So you came back," Elijah said. "I came back," she confirmed. "I came back to file the original grant as active, reclaim the property, and find out who knew what had been done to my father's estate and said nothing." She looked at him steadily when she said that last part, and Elijah understood the implication. She was not yet entirely certain which category he belonged, in the category of men who had known, or the category of men who had been deceived. "I bought the ranch in 1878, he said, "from Fitch's estate executor, a man named Corbin Lyle. I paid what I was told was fair market value. I had no knowledge of your claim." "Corbin Lyle," she said very quietly, and there it was again, that careful, controlled anger that lived just below the surface of her composure. "You know that name," he said. "Corbin Lyle was my father's business partner before Fitch was," she said. "He was also the one who told Fitch about my father's land in the first place. He introduced them." She paused. "I believe he orchestrated the entire arrangement. Fitch was the one who filed the abandonment notice, but Lyle was the one who knew exactly when to do it and how to make it hold." Elijah set down his coffee cup. The shape of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and it was uglier than he had initially understood. This was not simply a case of a dishonest land transaction. This was a calculated theft carried out against a dying man and his orphaned daughter, planned and executed by 2 men who had counted on the girl being too young, too poor, and too far away to fight back. And now one of those men owned the Red Haven Bank. "How much do you know about Lyle's current position in this town?" he asked. "I arrived 3 days ago," she said. "I've been careful about who I speak to, but I know he owns the bank. I know the current sheriff is a man named Pratt who has worked for Lyle in some capacity for at least 5 years. And I know that yesterday afternoon when I went to the land office to make an initial inquiry, the clerk I spoke to left by the back door within 10 minutes of my visit. You think he went to report to Lyle?" "I think it is very likely," she said. "Which means Lyle already knows I'm here. And if he knows I'm here, he knows why." Elijah leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a steadiness that was not entirely calm. Because what he was feeling underneath the steadiness was something considerably more complicated. He was looking at a woman who had been robbed of her inheritance at 17 years old, who had worked for 6 years to save enough money to come back and fight for it, who had walked into a town where the most powerful man was also her enemy, and who was sitting across from a stranger who held her deed in his coat pocket and had not burned it. She had every reason to trust no one. He found, looking at her, that he wanted very much to be the exception to that rule. "I have a proposal," he said. Her eyes were careful. "Go on." "The land described in your deed is the heart of my operation," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Losing 1,200 acres of river pasture would be a serious blow to the ranch, but the land was never legally mine to begin with, which means that regardless of the blow, it belongs to you and should be returned to you." "I appreciate your directness," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. "I'm also proposing that I help you, not as a charity, as a practical matter. You're alone in a town where a powerful man already knows you've come to take back something he stole. I know this territory, I know the legal process, and I have the resources to support a land claim through the courts. And," he added, "I have your deed, which I am now placing on the table between us." He took the folded parchment from his coat pocket and set it in the center of the table. She looked at it for a moment and then she looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "You stand to lose substantially." "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and because I would rather know I acted with honor than sleep well on stolen ground." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for the sounds of the street outside to filter back into his awareness. The distant creak of a wagon, the sound of someone calling out a name, the ordinary noise of a small western town going about its Tuesday. "All right, Mr. Donovan," she said at last. "I accept your proposal." She reached across the table and picked up the deed, and held it in her hands with a careful reverence that told him exactly how much it meant, not because it was paper, but because it was her father's name, written in ink that had survived 11 years of hidden darkness, finally coming back into the light. They spent the remainder of that morning at the table, mapping out what they knew and what they needed. Annie was extraordinarily organized. She had brought with her not only her father's copy of the grant and the letter from Warren's estate, but also a carefully assembled set of documents she had gathered over the previous 6 years. A certified copy of her father's death certificate, a letter from the Kansas City attorney outlining the legal basis for her claim, affidavits from 2 people who had known Thomas Atwood in Colorado Territory and could confirm his residency and improvements on the land, and a meticulous timeline she had written out herself that traced every event from her father's original filing in 1871, through Fitch's fraudulent abandonment notice in 1876, through the sale to Elijah in 1878. Elijah, looking at this assembled evidence, felt a new and specific kind of admiration. He had met very few people in his life, men or women, who could have spent 6 years working and saving and gathering evidence with such determined precision, holding on to a goal through what must have been stretches of genuine despair, never letting it go. "You're going to need an attorney here in the territory," he said. "Someone outside of Lyle's reach. Do you know of one?" "There's a man in Pueblo named Garrett Hale," he said. "He handled a boundary dispute for me 2 years ago. He's thorough and he doesn't scare easily. I'll send him a wire this afternoon. And in the meantime—" "In the meantime," Elijah said, "you should not be staying alone at this hotel. Lyle already knows you're here. If he's willing to file a fraudulent abandonment notice against a dying man's 17-year-old daughter, I'm not inclined to trust that he'll limit his response to legal maneuvers. She looked at him with a certain irony. Are you suggesting I come to stay at the ranch that is partly mine? He felt the corner of his mouth move. I'm suggesting you come and stay at the ranch, yes. I have a housekeeper, a woman named Martha Reyes who has worked for me for 4 years. It will be entirely proper, and you would be on land, you know. Your father chose it after all. Something in her expression softened for just a moment at that, the mention of her father, the idea that the land he had chosen was still there, still running alongside the river, still the same land he had walked and surveyed and loved. Then the composure came back, carefully fitted back into place. I will think about it, she said. That's all I ask, he said. They parted in the street outside the hotel. Elijah walked to the telegraph office and sent a detailed wire to Garrett Hale in Pueblo. Then he walked to the general store and bought supplies he had not specifically needed, because he wanted an excuse to remain in Red Haven for the afternoon and make sure Annie Atwood left the town without incident. He did not see her again until 4 o'clock, when she appeared outside the telegraph office herself, carrying her carpet bag, and looked at him with an expression of calm resolution. I've sent my trunk ahead by the freight wagon, she said. If the offer still stands, Mr. Donovan, I believe I'll take it. It stands, he said. They rode out of Red Haven as the sun was beginning its long autumn descent toward the mesa, the light turning the whole landscape the color of old gold. Annie rode a hired horse from the livery. She rode well, he noticed, with a practical ease that suggested she had not spent all 6 years in Kansas City drawing rooms. He rode his own horse, a dark bay named Clay, and they kept a polite and somewhat careful distance from each other, the way two people do when they are aware that something significant is beginning, but are not yet certain what to call it. She asked him questions about the ranch as they rode. Not personal questions, not yet questions about the land itself, the topography, the river, the quality of the grass in the lower pastures. She wanted to know about the winter wheat her father had grown, whether anyone had continued planting it. He told her that he had kept the wheat going in the lower section, not knowing whose history he was inheriting, only knowing that the land was fertile there and it seemed wasteful not to use it. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, he used to write to me about the wheat. He said it grew better there than anywhere he had ever seen. It does, Elijah said. The soil down by the river is extraordinary. There's something in it. He would have been glad to know it was still being planted, she said, very quietly. He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not be inadequate. The ranch came into view as the last of the sunset was fading, a solid, well-built house of stone and timber, a barn, a series of outbuildings, the bunkhouse where his 4 hands lived, fencing that ran clean and straight across the darkening pastures toward the river. Annie pulled her horse to a stop and sat very still looking at it. Your father's land began about a 1/4 mile further west, Elijah said, gesturing. The house he built is gone. A storm took it in 1879 before I came, but the foundations are still there. I can show you tomorrow if you like. She did not answer immediately. He watched her take the landscape in, the way the river caught the last light, the way the mountains rose in the west like a wall of shadow, and he wondered what it was like to look at a place you had inherited but never seen, a place that was supposed to have been your life and had instead been taken from you. Thank you, she said at last. Yes, I would like to see it. Martha Reyes, who was a broad, competent woman of 42 with silver in her dark hair and absolutely no patience for nonsense, received Annie with a matter-of-fact warmth that Elijah found immediately reassuring. She installed Annie in the best guest room, a room that had a fireplace and a window looking out toward the river, and brought her supper on a tray since the hour was late and the kitchen fire was mostly down. And then she came and found Elijah in the study and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she had opinions and was deciding whether to share them. She's been through something serious, Martha said. Yes, Elijah said. And you're going to help her? Yes. Martha looked at him for another moment. "Good," she said, with a finality that seemed to settle several things at once, and went back to the kitchen. Elijah sat in the study for a while, the fire burning low, thinking about the shape of what lay ahead. Garrett Hale would receive the wire and respond within a day or two. The legal process of reinstating the land grant would take time, weeks, perhaps months. There would be opposition from Lyle. He had no doubt of that. A man who had engineered a theft of this magnitude and sat on it for 6 years would not simply surrender when challenged. There would be pressure applied through whatever channels Lyle could access legal delays, possibly the sheriff, possibly other forms of intimidation that Elijah preferred not to think about too specifically. He was also aware, sitting there in the quiet study, that he had involved himself completely in a situation that could cost him a significant portion of his land and a great deal of his time and energy, on behalf of a woman he had met that morning. He found that he could not identify anything about this that he regretted. The following days took on a rhythm that was simultaneously tense and, in a strange way, quietly domestic. Annie was an early riser. So was Elijah. They found themselves at the breakfast table before the hands were up, with coffee and the bread that Martha had left from the previous day, and they would go over documents together or simply sit with the comfortable, careful silence of people learning the shape of each other. She went to see her father's foundations on the second morning, and he went with her. It was a clear, cold October day, the grass silver with frost, the river running quick and dark between its banks. The foundations were stone Thomas Atwood had built to last, and they were still solid, still roughly square, still with the remnants of a doorstep that someone had laid with careful evenness. Annie stood in the middle of what had been the front room of her father's house and looked at the mountains, and Elijah stood back far enough to give her privacy without abandoning her, and after a while she crouched down and picked up a small piece of stone from the foundation wall and held it in her palm. "He was a good man," she said. "Not perfect, but good. He worked hard all his life for this, and they took it from him while he was dying, and then they made sure I couldn't get it back when I was still young enough to be easily dismissed." She stood up, the stone still in her hand. "I'm not easily dismissed anymore." "No," Elijah said, "you are not." She looked at him with those direct, dark eyes. "Does that frighten you?" "Not remotely," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she put the stone in her coat pocket and turned back toward the ranch. Garrett Hale arrived from Pueblo on the 4th day, having come by horse rather than stage because he said the stage took twice as long, and he never slept well in moving vehicles. He was a lean, sandy-haired man of around 40 with the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was usually 2 steps ahead of the current conversation, and he looked at Annie's assembled documents for approximately an hour, and then looked up and said, with simple satisfaction, that she had a case. "The fraudulent abandonment notice is the linchpin," he said. "Fitch filed it without any legitimate basis. There is no evidence of actual abandonment. The improvements were maintained. The taxes were paid through February of 1876 by Thomas Atwood himself, and there is documented evidence that the heir was in existence and had been notified of her inheritance. The notice was filed 1 month after Thomas's death, before any reasonable effort to locate and notify the heir could have been made. A competent judge will not allow it to stand." "What about the sale to Mr. Donovan?" Annie asked. Hale glanced at Elijah. "Mr. Donovan's purchase was in good faith. He is not legally liable for the fraud. However, the portion of the land covered by your grant cannot be legally conveyed to him because Fitch did not own it to sell. Mr. Donovan will need to file a claim against Fitch's estate, such as it is, for the portion of the purchase price attributable to that land." "Fitch's estate was administered by Lyle," Elijah said. "Of course it was," Hale said, unsurprised. "That will be its own legal complication, but it is separate from Miss Atwood's claim." They spent the day going over the strategy. Hale would file the initial claim in the Pueblo District Court, which was outside of Sheriff Pratt's jurisdiction and further from Lyle's direct influence. He would request an emergency injunction preserving the status of the land during proceedings, which would prevent any attempt by Lyle to transfer or encumber it. The affidavits from the witnesses to Thomas Atwood's residency would be filed simultaneously. How long? Annie asked. For the injunction, perhaps 2 weeks. For the full hearing, likely 3 to 4 months, Hale said. This is assuming Lyle does not do something dramatic to complicate matters. He will, Annie said. He will, Hale agreed. I would prefer he do it in court where it can be countered. My concern is that he will do it elsewhere first. After Hale left to begin the filing process, Elijah found Annie standing on the porch in the cold evening air, looking out toward the darkening pastures. He brought her a cup of coffee and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Hale is good, she said at last. He is, Elijah confirmed. This is really going to happen, she said. Not a question exactly, but something between a question and a declaration, as though she were testing the idea against reality. Yes, he said. It is. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He could see the slight tension in her shoulders begin to ease just fractionally, and he understood what it meant. It was the physical release of someone who has been braced for a fight for so long that standing down, even slightly, feels like learning a new language. I need to say something to you, she said. Go ahead, he said. When I came to Red Haven, I had prepared myself for every possibility I could imagine. I had prepared for legal obstruction. I had prepared for Lyle's interference. I had prepared to fight alone for as long as it took. She paused. I had not prepared for someone like you. He looked at her profile, the clean line of it against the fading sky. Someone who did the right thing, he said. Someone who did the right thing without needing to be persuaded, she said. Without needing anything from me. You simply did it. You found that deed and you came looking for me instead of the fireplace. It was yours, he said again. It was the same thing he had said in Red Haven, and he meant it just as fully now. She turned and looked at him, and whatever it was that passed between them in that moment was quiet and clean and completely real, like water finding the true level of a riverbed. Thank you, Elijah, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. You're welcome, Annie, he said. The reply had come from Lyle within the week, and it was not delivered through any court. It was delivered at dawn on a Monday morning, when one of Elijah's hands, a young man named Pete Carver, found that someone had cut the fence along the eastern boundary of the property and run off approximately 40 head of cattle into the ravine land beyond the mesa. Pete came to the house at a run, and Elijah was saddled and out before full light. It took 3 hours to find the cattle and bring them back, during which time he had several opportunities to think about Corbin Lyle and to feel a hard, quiet anger that was quite different from the contemplative frustration he usually experienced in business disputes. This was personal. This was a message. He came back to find Annie in the barn, having apparently taken it upon herself to help Martha move the horses to the inner paddock in case there was further trouble, and her coat was dusty and her hair had come partially down, and she looked entirely unbothered by any of this. How many did you recover? She asked. All 40, he said. The fence is being repaired. It was a warning, she said. Yes, he said. I'm sorry, she said. This is because of me. It's because of Lyle, he said. There's a difference, and if you're about to tell me you should leave or handle this on your own, please understand that I have absolutely no intention of allowing that. She looked at him with an expression that was both startled and something considerably warmer. I was not going to say that, she said. I was going to say that we should inform Hale immediately and document this as an act of intimidation in connection with the land claim. He felt the corner of his mouth do its small movement again. That is a much better idea, he said. I know, she said, and there was a glint in her dark eyes that in other circumstances might have been called humor. He sent word to Hale. He also rode to Red Haven that afternoon and paid a visit to the land office, where he formally requested Buell to produce the original abandonment notice filed by Fitch, citing ongoing legal proceedings. Buell produced it with the look of a man who was being asked to assist in his own discomfort, but produced it nonetheless. Elijah had it witnessed and took a certified copy. He also, before leaving town, walked past the Redhaven Bank and let Corbin Lyle, who was visible through the front window, speaking to a teller, see him do it. He wanted Lyle to know that the cattle incident had accomplished nothing except to make him angrier and more determined. Lyle was a thick-necked man in his mid-50s, with the kind of carefully maintained respectability that only money could buy: good suit, trimmed beard, the air of civic importance that small western towns tended to bestow on the men who held their mortgages. He saw Elijah through the window and his expression did not change, which told Elijah that he had considerable practice at maintaining it. Elijah walked on. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most quietly extraordinary of Elijah Donovan's life, which had contained a substantial number of remarkable things already. He had driven cattle up from Texas at 19, survived a winter in the Rockies at 23, built a ranch from a failing operation into a prosperous one through nothing but stubbornness and good judgment. But none of those things had prepared him for what it was like to share his house with Annie Atwood. She was organized where he was instinctive. She was precise where he was broad. She read in the evenings by the fire. She had brought books with her in that carpet bag, which he found entirely charming. And she had opinions about everything from cattle grazing rotation to the structural efficiency of the barn's current layout. And she expressed those opinions with a directness that he found, initially, somewhat startling, and then, very quickly, completely natural. She also laughed, when she let herself, with a completeness that transformed her entire face, and he found himself doing increasingly ridiculous things in conversation to provoke it. Martha watched all of this with the expression of someone watching a weather pattern develop, interested, knowing, and entirely unsurprised. "You're in trouble," Martha told him one morning in the kitchen, with the serene bluntness of someone who has known a person long enough to dispense with tact. "I'm aware," Elijah said. "Does she know?" He thought about it. "She's perceptive," he said. "She knows something." "Then be straightforward," Martha said. "She's had too much dishonesty in her life already. She'll respond to honesty the way that soil out there responds to water." He carried that thought with him for several days. He was not, by nature, a man who found emotional expression easy. He had grown up on a ranch in northern Texas in a family where feelings were practical matters. You felt them, they informed your decisions, and you got on with things. Extended verbal exploration of internal states had not been heavily practiced, and yet something about Annie made him want to try. It was on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks into her stay, when the occasion presented itself. They had been sitting by the fire after supper. Martha had made a particularly good stew, and there was corn bread, and they had all eaten very well. And Martha had gone to bed, and the fire was burning quietly, and the house felt warm and settled around them. And Annie had set down her book and was looking at the fire with an expression of genuine peace that he had not seen on her face before, and that, accordingly, he did not want to disturb. But she looked up as though she had felt him watching, which perhaps she had. "You're thinking loudly," she said. "Probably," he admitted. "Say it then," she said. "Whatever it is." He took a breath. "I find," he said carefully, "that this has become considerably more than a land dispute for me." The firelight moved on her face. She did not look away. "I know," she said very quietly. "I don't want you to misunderstand my intentions," he said. "I'm not saying this to complicate the situation, and I'm not saying it because I want anything from you in return. The land claim will proceed regardless of anything else. I want you to know that absolutely clearly." "I do know that," she said. "It's one of the reasons I trust you. But I also don't want to be dishonest," he said. "You've had enough dishonesty. And the honest thing is that I think about you considerably, and not only in the context of deeds and attorneys and Corbin Lyle." She was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved over the pastures with the voice of an autumn night, cold and clean and very wide. "I came here for my father's land," she said at last. That's true. That was the whole truth when I arrived. She paused. It may no longer be the entire truth. Something in his chest, which had been tense for the answer, released. What does that mean? He asked. It means, she said, with a careful, small smile that he was beginning to understand was her version of enormous emotion, that I am also thinking about things that are not solely deeds and attorneys. He looked at her across the fire-lit room and felt something that he could only describe, inadequately, as rightness. Then we understand each other, he said. We understand each other, she confirmed. Nothing more was said that night, but something had been established between them with the same quiet authority as a surveyor's mark, precise, permanent, acknowledged by both parties. Lyle's next move came through the court system, as Hale had predicted it would, and it was more sophisticated than the cattle incident. His attorney filed a counter-motion in the Pueblo District Court, challenging the validity of Thomas Atwood's original grant on the grounds that the survey documentation did not conform to the territorial standards that had been in effect in 1871. A highly technical argument that Hale said was almost certainly without merit, but would require substantial documentation to defeat. It also bought Lyle time, which was the real point. Every month of delay was a month in which Annie was living on Elijah's charity, which was a month during which Lyle presumably hoped she would run out of money or patience or both. He did not understand Annie Atwood very well. She responded to the counter-motion by spending 4 days at the table in the study going through her father's original survey documents with a level of technical focus that astonished Elijah, who had not known she had any background in surveying. She explained, when he asked, that she had spent several months in Kansas City with a retired surveyor who had agreed to teach her the basics in exchange for clerical work, specifically because she had known that her father's survey documentation would be central to any legal claim. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for this 6 years ago. She produced a 20-page written analysis of her father's survey methodology, with specific citations to the territorial standards of 1871, demonstrating that the documentation was in complete conformance with the requirements of that period. She sent it to Hale, who read it and said it was, in his professional opinion, better than anything he could have prepared himself on the same subject. The technical counter-motion collapsed at the district court hearing in December. They went to Pueblo together for the hearing. It was Elijah's first time seeing Annie in a formal legal setting, and he watched her sit in the gallery beside him with the same composed, focused attention she brought to everything, watching Hale argue the case with the expression of someone who has rehearsed every exchange already and is simply verifying that reality is meeting expectations. The judge, a heavy-set man named Caldwell who had a reputation for impatience with procedural games, dismissed Lyle's counter-motion in approximately 45 minutes and awarded the survey documentation its full evidentiary weight. Outside the courthouse afterward in the Pueblo street with the December wind cutting down from the mountains, Annie stood in the cold air and closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them they were slightly bright with something she would not call tears but which Elijah recognized as their near relation. "One step," she said. "A big one," he said. "There are more to go." "Yes," he said, "but we're going them." She looked at him, and there was such a fullness in her expression, gratitude and relief, and something warmer and more complicated, all mixed together, that he did what he had been wanting to do for several weeks, which was to reach out and take her hand. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment. Then she tightened her fingers around his. They walked back to the hotel where they had separate rooms that he was beginning to find a profoundly unsatisfactory arrangement. Corbin Lyle, it turned out, was not finished. In January, a man came to the ranch who introduced himself as a representative of a Denver land company and offered to buy the entire Donovan property, all 4,000 acres, for an amount that was slightly above market value, but not so much as to seem openly suspicious. Elijah received him in the study and listened to the entire pitch with polite attention, and then said that the property was not for sale and showed the man to the door. When he described the visit to Annie that evening, she said immediately, "He's trying to buy his way out of the legal claim. If he purchases the property through a third party before the claim is finalized, he can argue that the transaction complicates the grant reinstatement." "Can it actually do that?" Elijah asked. "Not if the injunction holds," she said, "and the injunction is in place, but he may be betting that you would sell, and that would create enough confusion to delay things further." "He bet wrong," Elijah said. She looked at him with that warm, direct gaze. "I know he did," she said. In late January, something happened that was neither legal nor financial, but was far more personally alarming. Annie was returning from a ride along the river. She had taken to riding out in the afternoons, always staying within sight of the ranch, when she passed a man on the road she did not recognize, who stopped and asked her name with a very specific and watching quality that she later described as feeling deliberate. She gave him a false name and rode on, and came back to the ranch, and told Elijah with a composure that he could see was being maintained through an act of will. He doubled the hand's presence on the outer perimeter of the property for the following 2 weeks, and he sent another letter to Hale describing the incident. He also, for the first time, had a very direct conversation with Annie about her safety, which she received with less resistance than he had expected. "I'm not being reckless," she said. "I understand the danger." "I know you're not reckless," he said. "You are also the most careful and capable person I know. I'm also aware that Lyle has more resources than either of us would prefer, and that I would find it completely intolerable if anything happened to you." She looked at him at that, and the look was longer and deeper than most of their exchanges. "Would you?" she said very quietly. "Annie," he said, with a kind of helpless straightforwardness, "I think you know by now that I care about you considerably more than I have said." She was silent for a moment. Then, "Say it then." He had been waiting for the right moment, and he had been preparing the right words, and now, looking at her in the cold January lamplight in the study of his house, he understood that the right moment was always the present one, and the right words were simply the true ones. "I love you," he said. "I know that's fast by most measures. I know we've been navigating something complicated. But I have never met anyone like you, Annie, and I don't expect I ever will. You are the most determined, principled, extraordinary person I have encountered in my life, and I want, if you are willing, to be more than your ally in this." She looked at him for a long time. The fire burned. The ranch was quiet around them. "When I came back here," she said, "I thought I was coming back for land, and I was. But I think the land was the reason I came, and you are what I found when I got here." He moved to her side of the table, which was not a large table, and she turned toward him, and what happened next was very quiet and very right, and when he kissed her, it was with the same combination of absolute certainty and perfect care with which he did everything that mattered to him. She kissed him back with the same. It was quite possibly, he thought, the best moment of his life to date, which was a high standard to achieve given that the day had also included a very good breakfast. Martha, who was apparently incapable of not knowing things that happened in her vicinity, said the following morning at breakfast with complete tranquility, "It's about time," and then poured them both more coffee, and the subject was considered closed. February brought the formal hearing date, set for the 10th of March in the Pueblo District Court, and with it, a focused and energetic period of final preparation. Hale came out to the ranch twice in the last weeks of February to go over testimony and documentation. The 2 witnesses who had provided affidavits were confirmed to appear in person. Elijah had commissioned a new professional survey of the boundary land that matched precisely to Thomas Atwood's original work. It also brought a development that changed the shape of things significantly. One of Elijah's hands, a man named Samuel Torres, who had grown up in Red Haven and had connections throughout the territory that his quiet manner tended to obscure, came to Elijah one morning with information he had gathered through channels he declined to specify. The information was this: there existed, in the possession of a former county recorder named Hiram Cross, who had left Red Haven for Santa Fe in 1878, a journal in which Cross had documented his knowledge of the Fitch abandonment notice, including his belief that the filing was fraudulent and that it had been arranged in consultation between Fitch and Lyle, specifically to clear the title for resale. Cross had not come forward at the time because he had been paid to leave. He had taken the money, he had left, and he had apparently been living with his knowledge like a stone in his shoe ever since. Hale went to Santa Fe. He was gone 10 days. He came back with a certified statement from Hiram Cross, who was now 61 years old and apparently quite eager to unburden himself of what he knew, and the statement was devastating in its specificity. Cross had been present at a conversation between Fitch and Lyle in February of 1876, in which Lyle had explicitly stated that Thomas Atwood was expected to die within the month, and that the abandonment notice should be filed immediately after his death, before the daughter could be located. Cross quoted the conversation in detail. He named the date. He named the room in the Red Haven Hotel where it had occurred. He had remembered it for 6 years. He had it all perfectly preserved in guilt and distance. Hale read the statement aloud in the study at the ranch, and when he finished there was a silence that Elijah recognized as the particular silence of a battle turning. Annie sat very still. Her hands were flat on the table. "This is enough," Hale said. "This, combined with everything else, is more than enough. I would be extremely surprised if the court rules against the claim at this stage." Annie looked at the statement for a long time. Then she looked up, and her expression was complicated relief, and the old grief that never entirely left her face when she was thinking about her father and something that might have been the very first stirring of something like peace. "He was going to take it eventually," she said. "My father. He was going to find out what Fitch and Lyle had done and come forward, and they knew that." "Very likely," Hale said. "So they made sure to act before he could," she said, "while he was dying. While I was too far away and too young." "Yes," Hale said gently. She was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened up and said with the firmness that was the signature of her character, "All right. Let us make sure March 10th means the end of this." Elijah, who had been watching her, reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and pressed his fingers once in acknowledgement. The week before the hearing, Lyle made his final move. It was not through attorneys or land companies this time. He went directly to the district court and filed a motion alleging that Elijah Donovan had fraudulently colluded with Annie Atwood to manufacture the deed, and that the document he claimed to have found in his land records had in fact been created by Annie and planted there to form a false basis for her claim. It was a breathtaking accusation. It was also, Hale said with magnificent calm, completely insupportable, given that the deed was on original parchment that could be dated independently, given that it bore a legitimate notary seal from 1871 that could be verified, and given that the county records themselves showed corresponding documentation from the same period. "He's desperate," Hale said. "This is the accusation of a man who has run out of legitimate options." "He's still dangerous," Annie said. "Extremely," Hale agreed. "But in court danger requires evidence. He has none." The 10th of March, 1883, was a bright, cold day in Pueblo. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. The case had drawn attention, partly because it involved a substantial land dispute, and partly because the story of Annie Atwood's claim had circulated through the town in the way that stories of clear injustice tend to circulate, gaining sympathy as they go. Corbin Lyle was present with his own attorney, a man from Denver named Ratchet who had a reputation for procedural aggression that his slightly unfortunate name did nothing to soften. He sat in the gallery across the aisle from where Annie and Elijah sat, and he looked, Elijah thought, like a man who had been sleeping poorly. Judge Caldwell conducted the hearing with the same brisk efficiency he had shown in December. Hale presented the case in full, the grant documentation, the survey analysis, the certified death records, the affidavits, the Hiram Cross statement, the fraudulent abandonment notice, the chronological evidence of Lyle's involvement in the original scheme. He built it methodically and with precision, and when he was done, the case had the weight and clarity of something completely documented and utterly unassailable. Ratchet challenged where he could. He challenged the cross statement on grounds of timeliness and motivation. He challenged the deed's provenance. He challenged the survey analysis. Judge Caldwell heard each challenge with the expression of a man who had heard better arguments in his time and was keeping his opinion to himself with some effort. Hiram Cross, appearing in person, gave his testimony in a steady, low voice that filled the courtroom with the specific quiet that descends when everyone present knows they are hearing the truth. He described what he had witnessed. He described what he had been paid. He described the 32-year-old version of himself who had taken the money and left, and the 61-year-old version of himself who was in this courtroom, because the leaving had not been as clean as the money had implied it would be. When Cross left the witness stand, the room was very quiet. Judge Caldwell deliberated for slightly over 2 hours, which Hale later said was, in his experience, a remarkably short time for a case of this complexity, and which he attributed to the judge having formed his opinion approximately 45 minutes into the proceedings. The ruling was complete and unambiguous. Thomas Atwood's land grant of 1871 was reinstated in full. The fraudulent abandonment notice filed by Gerald Fitch in 1876 was voided. The 1,200 acres described in the grant were returned to the ownership of Annie Atwood as sole heir of Thomas Atwood. Additionally, Judge Caldwell referred the matter of Corbin Lyle's involvement in the original fraud to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal review. Annie sat very still while the ruling was read. She had her hands in her lap, fingers intertwined, and she did not move until the last word was spoken. Then she let out a breath that was quiet and long and carried in it 6 years of patience and distance and work and waiting. Elijah took her hand. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she said very quietly, "Papa would have been glad. He would have been very proud," Elijah said. She squeezed his hand and turned back to face the courtroom, and there was a composure in her face now that was different from the controlled composure he had come to know over the previous months. This was not composure maintained against difficulty, but composure that had been earned, that had been justified, that rested on something solid. Outside the courthouse, in the March sunshine, Hale shook their hands with the satisfied air of a man who has done his best work and knows it. Ratchet departed without speaking. Lyle was escorted from the building by a county deputy who had a letter from the prosecutor's office requesting his cooperation with the criminal investigation, and his expression, as he passed Elijah in the doorway, was the expression of a man who has lost everything he thought was secured, and is only beginning to understand the full dimension of what that means. Elijah did not speak to him. He simply watched him go, and felt nothing about it except a clean, specific satisfaction. They celebrated that evening at the best restaurant Pueblo had to offer, which was called the Continental, and had tablecloths and candles, and served a beef tenderloin that Elijah had to concede was remarkable. Hale joined them. Martha had been told by express letter sent with Samuel Torr's earlier in the day, and had apparently celebrated in her own way, because when they arrived home the following afternoon there was a cake. The return journey to the ranch was nothing like the silent, careful ride they had made back from Red Haven in October. They rode close together, and Annie really talked, freely, and without the measured quality she had maintained for months, about her father's letters, about the descriptions he had sent her of the land, about the things she wanted to do with the 1,200 acres. She wanted to restore the pasture boundaries to their original lines. She wanted to rebuild on the old foundations a small house, practical, well-made. She wanted to plant winter wheat in the lower field this coming autumn. "That's a great deal of work," Elijah said. "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of work." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm merely pointing out that 1,200 acres is considerable for one person to manage." She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in the glance that was both aware and waiting. "I may not be managing it alone," she said. "No," he said. "That would depend," she said, "on whether someone with an adjacent property was inclined toward a more formal arrangement." He pulled Clay to a halt, and she stopped beside him, and they were in the middle of the trail with the river visible ahead of them and the mountains blue-gray behind it, and the whole March sky enormous and clear above. "Annie Atwood," he said, "I have been inclined toward a formal arrangement for approximately 3 months. I was waiting for the legal matter to be resolved, so you could not possibly suspect that my inclination was connected to the land." She looked at him with those dark, direct, extraordinary eyes. "And now the legal matter is resolved." "And now the legal matter is resolved," he confirmed. "Then perhaps you should say what you intend to say, Mr. Donovan." "Miss Atwood," he said, with the formal address that felt at this moment like the most personal thing he had ever said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, not a hesitating moment, but a savoring one, the look of a woman who has waited a long time for good things and is taking proper account of one arriving at last. "Yes," she said, "I will." He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, and she leaned to meet him, and the river ran past below them with its ancient, indifferent sound, and the mountains stood in the west exactly as they had stood, while Thomas Atwood surveyed this land and decided it was worth his life. And the sky was the kind of enormous Colorado blue that made a person feel simultaneously very small and completely at home. They were married in June of 1883, in Red Haven, which might seem an unlikely choice given what that town had represented, but Annie had her reasons for it, and Elijah understood them. She wanted to be married in the town nearest her father's land. She wanted the ceremony to happen where the history had happened, because she was not the kind of person who ran from places that had been difficult. She was the kind of person who went back to difficult places and changed what they meant. The wedding was held in the church on the main street, a small, whitewashed building with a bell that Elijah had always thought was slightly too large for the structure, as though whoever had installed it had been making a point. Annie wore a dress of dark blue silk that she had, in characteristic fashion, made a practical choice about. She had selected a design that could be worn again on good occasions, which it subsequently was, many times. Hale attended, having made the journey from Pueblo with the particular satisfaction of a man who considers himself partly responsible for the union. Martha wept quietly and with great dignity for approximately the first 3 minutes of the ceremony, and then composed herself and remained completely dry-eyed through the vows, which she later said was because she had decided tears at weddings were inefficient. Samuel Torres and the other hands were there, and several people from town who had watched the events of the past months with the attentive sympathy of people in small communities, and an older woman from the next county over who had known Thomas Atwood in his early years in the territory, and had come specifically to see his daughter married, and who cried so thoroughly and generously that she was possibly making up for Martha. The vows were simple and direct, which suited both of them. The moment that would stay with Elijah for the rest of his life was the moment Annie said, "I will," in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain, with her eyes on him and her hands holding his and the bell above them too large for its church. They spent the summer building Annie's house on her father's foundations. Elijah had offered to hire a construction crew, and Annie had considered this and then suggested they do as much of it themselves as was practical, with help from the hands on the heavier work, and he had agreed because he understood why. This house meant more than shelter. It was the thing her father had built and lost, rebuilt in permanence. By September, the house stood complete stone and timber like the original, with a covered porch that looked out toward the river, a kitchen that was considerably more modern than anything Thomas Atwood would have had in 1871, 2 good rooms, a proper fireplace, and a doorstep laid with the same careful evenness as the one that had survived beneath the ruins. Annie set the stone she had kept in her coat pocket since October into the kitchen wall, where it fit between two larger stones as though it had always belonged there. "There," she said, pressing her palm flat against it. "There it is." She turned around and he was leaning in the doorway watching her, and the September afternoon light came through the window and made the room the color of everything he wanted his life to contain. "Well," he said, "does it suit?" She looked around the room, out the window, back at him. "It suits perfectly," she said. Corbin Lyle in the autumn of 1883 was indicted by the territorial prosecutor on 2 counts of fraud related to the land scheme and 1 count of conspiracy. He spent a considerable portion of his financial resources on his defense and mounted the kind of legal fight that wealthy men mount when they are cornered, which was determined and creative and ultimately unsuccessful. He was convicted in early 1884 and served 18 months in the territorial prison before being released, at which point he left Colorado entirely and was not heard from in those parts again. The Red Haven Bank changed hands, was purchased by a consortium from Denver, and underwent a thorough reorganization that resulted, among other things, in 3 local ranchers having mortgages that were significantly more favorable than the ones Lyle had offered them. The sheriff, Pratt, resigned his position shortly after Lyle's indictment and was replaced by a younger man named Aldous Fields who had the great advantage, for the town's purposes, of owing Corbin Lyle absolutely nothing. Life on the Purgatoire River settled into the shape of something good. Elijah ran his cattle operation, which was prospering well, and managed the ranch hands with the practical fairness that they had always respected him for. He continued to grow winter wheat in the lower pastures, their pastures now, the boundary between his land and Annie's being more a matter of legal record than any practical divide in daily life. Annie managed her 1,200 acres with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything. She expanded the wheat operation in the first year, added a small orchard on the eastern slope where the soil was different and the light was good, and worked with Samuel Torr's knowledge of the local terrain to redirect a small irrigation channel in a way that improved the pasture land considerably. She also corresponded with Garrett Hale regularly, because the experience of the land claim had given her an interest in territorial land law that went beyond her personal situation. Hale encouraged her to read more widely on the subject, and she did, acquiring books through a bookseller in Denver and spending winter evenings in the study of the main house. She divided her time between the 2 structures with a flexibility that raised absolutely no one's eyebrows because they were married, and the land was shared in all but the most technical legal sense, working through volumes of legal commentary with her methodical attention. In the spring of 1884, she told Elijah she was expecting their first child. They were sitting on the porch of her house, Annie's house, Thomas's rebuilt house, watching the river in the early evening light, and she told him in the direct, simple way she told him everything, and he set down the cup he was holding and looked at her and felt the kind of joy that does not immediately find words because words seem inadequate to the task. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the chair. "Well," he said at last. "Well," she agreed, with that small, private smile. How are you feeling?" "Very well, mostly," she said. "The mornings are somewhat challenging. Martha has opinions about this which she is sharing freely." He laughed, which startled a bird from the cottonwood by the river. "Martha has opinions about everything." "Yes," Annie said. "In this case they are mostly useful." She paused. "I want our child to know this land," she said, "the way my father knew it. I want them to grow up walking along that river and knowing that it is theirs." "They will," Elijah said. "They absolutely will." The child was born in November of 1884. A healthy boy they named Thomas James Donovan, Thomas for Annie's father, James for Elijah's grandfather, which Elijah noted was the kind of naming convention that managed to honor 2 families simultaneously, which was entirely characteristic of Annie's approach to things. Thomas was, from the beginning, a child of considerable personality. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's general stubbornness, though Elijah maintained it was the other way around, which Annie allowed without conceding. Martha was absolutely devoted to him, which surprised no one. She was also deeply principled about spoiling, which surprised no one either, and the balance she struck between these two positions was, Elijah thought, a kind of domestic masterwork. Samuel Torres, who had taken on increasing responsibility at the ranch and was now effectively the foreman, made a small wooden horse for Thomas's first Christmas that was of such expert craftsmanship that Annie put it on the shelf rather than the floor, which Torres protested was not the intended purpose, and Annie said the floor was for the less beautiful toys, and this one was for looking at, and Torres was too delighted by this to argue. The seasons moved through the Purgatoire Valley with the patient rhythm of land that does not register human difficulty: summer heat, autumn gold, the long white winters with snow on the mesa rim and ice at the river edges, spring mud, and the return of green to the pastures. Elijah loved all of it, which he had always known, but he found that loving it alongside Annie added a dimension that had been absent before, because she saw details in the land that he, who had lived on it for years, had somehow not seen, and she pointed them out with the quiet enthusiasm of someone whose relationship with this particular landscape was also a relationship with a history she was reclaiming piece by piece. She showed Thomas, as soon as he could walk steadily, the place in the west pasture where the first wildflowers came up in early April, a particular cluster of blue columbine that appeared without fail in the same 10-foot circle every year. She showed him the way the river changed color with the seasoned dark green in summer, gray-brown in spring flood, nearly black in winter. She showed him the foundations of the house her father had built, which were now part of the landscape of the new house, incorporated into the western garden wall, not erased but included. In the autumn of 1886, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Ruth, who had her father's lighter coloring and her mother's precise, watching gaze, and who was, from the moment she could make her preferences known, entirely certain of what they were, and fully prepared to communicate them to whoever was in range. By this time, the Donovan operation along the Purgatoire was one of the more respected ranches in the southern Colorado Territory, which was not a status Elijah had pursued, but found he was glad of when it came with reasonable neighbors and the kind of community relationships that made difficult years easier. There were difficult years. A drought in 1886 that required real management and some hard decisions about cattle numbers, and a winter in 1887 that was punishing even by Colorado standards, with snowfall that came in December and did not significantly relent until March, and required a sustained, exhausting effort to protect the livestock and maintain operations. Through all of it, Annie was his partner in the fullest and most literal sense, working alongside him in the daily logistics of the ranch, applying her particular intelligence to the problems that arose, and maintaining, through the worst of the drought and the worst of the winter, an equilibrium that he could feel himself steadying against. She was not impervious to difficulty. She worried, and she was tired, and there were evenings in the hard winter of 1887 when she sat in the lamplight with a quietness that was not peace but exhaustion held with grace. But she was never defeated, and she never let circumstances determine her character, and this was, he thought, the most fundamentally remarkable thing about her. The way she had taken a history that included genuine injustice and genuine loss and turned it into fuel for something purposeful, without bitterness. He told her this once, late in the winter of 1887, when the snow was still deep on the mesa, and Thomas was asleep in his room, and Clara was newly arrived, and Martha had gone to bed early, and they were sitting by the fire in the main house, with the silence of a very cold night around them. He said he thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and not in a general or diplomatic way, but specifically in the way she had refused to let what was done to her define her. She looked at him for a while. Then she said, "I had a very angry period. In Kansas City in the first years after I came back. I was angry in a way that I did not always show because I was also working, and anger and productive work do not always coexist efficiently. But it was there." "What changed it?" he asked. "Time," she said, "and purpose." And she paused, and the firelight moved on her face, the knowledge that my father was not angry. He was not an angry man. He built something beautiful with what he had, and he lost it unjustly, but I don't think he died angry. I think he died with faith that the land would come back to where it belonged eventually. She was quiet for a moment. I wanted to be worthy of that faith, and anger didn't help with that. He reached out and touched her face because he wanted to and because words were, again, insufficient. She turned her cheek into his hand, and they sat by the fire while the Colorado winter pressed its cold weight against the windows, and the ranch around them was settled and safe and theirs. In the spring of 1888, something happened that Elijah had not entirely expected, which was that Annie came to him with a project that was not about the ranch or the land, but about something wider. She had been in correspondence, she told him, with an attorney in Denver who was working on behalf of several families in the territory who had had land claims denied on questionable grounds. The situations varied, but there was a common thread: documentation existed, legal recourse existed, but the families lacked the resources and the knowledge to pursue it. The Denver attorney, a man named Webb, had heard about Annie's case through Hale and had written to her asking whether she had any interest in providing consultation. "What kind of consultation?" Elijah asked. "He wants me to help review documentation and explain the survey aspects of the claims," she said, "to help families understand what they have and how to present it. He would handle the actual legal process." "This is not a small undertaking," Elijah said. "No," she said. "But it is something I know how to do, and some of these families have been waiting for years. One of them has a situation almost exactly like mine: a deceased parent, a young heir, documentation that exists but is not being taken seriously." She looked at him. "I know what that is." He looked at her, this woman he had married who continued at every turn to be exactly who she was. "I think," he said, "you should do it." She worked with Webb's office through the spring and summer of 1888, corresponding extensively by letter and making 2 trips to Denver with Elijah's company, and, when he could not be spared from the ranch, with Samuel Torres as escort. Of the 7 cases she reviewed in that first engagement, 5 resulted in successful land claim restorations. The other 2 were pending. The Denver newspapers, which liked stories with a clear shape, wrote about it once, briefly, describing Annie as a woman who had fought for her own inheritance and was now helping others fight for theirs. The piece was accurate if somewhat simplified, and Annie read it with the expression of someone who finds press coverage slightly embarrassing but appreciates the practical effect. Webb wrote her a letter of such genuine appreciation that she kept it in the document case alongside her father's deed, which she still kept, always, in the study on the shelf where both houses could see it. Their 3rd child arrived in the winter of 1889, a boy they named William for no ancestor in particular, just a name that seemed right, who was from the beginning the sunniest of the 3 children, with a disposition of general goodwill toward the world that his older siblings regarded with varying combinations of affection and suspicion. Thomas, by now a serious-faced 5-year-old with his mother's precision and his father's broad physical presence, had taken it upon himself to be William's instructor in all matters relating to the ranch. This involved a great deal of explaining that William was too young to follow and nodding from William that was too wide-eyed to be understanding, but the intention was clear and the effect was charming. Clara, who was 3 and fully in command of her opinions, simply adopted William as an audience for her own extensive commentaries on ranch life, the river, the columbine flowers, and whatever else she had decided required explanation at any given moment. Martha, who was now in her late 40s and had not slowed in any perceptible way, presided over the three of them with a steady hand and an absolute fairness that the children trusted completely. Samuel Torres, now 28 and firmly established as the foreman of the combined operation, announced in the autumn of 1889 that he was courting a woman from the neighboring county named Elena Vasquez, and Elijah and Annie received this news with the warmth of people who are happy and want their friends to be happy, and the wedding the following spring was celebrated on the Donovan property with considerable festivity. The decade turned. The territory of Colorado had been a state since 1876, and the years of the early 1880s that had been marked by the kind of frontier precariousness that characterized territories were giving way to something more settled. Red Haven had grown, a school had been established, the church had acquired a second bell to go with its already oversized first one, and the bank under its new management had become a genuinely useful institution rather than an instrument of one man's financial control. The land along the Purgatoire continued to be what it had always been, extraordinary. The winter wheat grew in the lower pastures with the consistency and richness that Thomas Atwood had written to his daughter about in letters she had kept for 17 years before she found her way back to them. The cattle grazed the upper pastures. The orchard on the eastern slope produced apples from its third year onward that were of sufficient quality that Martha had strong opinions about how they were used, and everyone else deferred to her. The house on Thomas Atwood's foundations grew over the years, a room added when William arrived, a study built onto the back where Annie worked on her correspondence and her documents, a deeper porch that caught the afternoon sun in the way she had always wanted. The main house, Elijah's original stone house, remained the center of the operation, the place where the ranch business happened and the hands ate supper on Fridays, and the bookkeeping happened on Saturday mornings. But Annie's house was the center of something else, of the family and its daily life, of the warmth that she had brought to a piece of land that had been reclaimed from wrongness and made right, of the specific and irreplaceable sense that this place was where it was supposed to be. One evening in the summer of 1890, Elijah found Annie sitting on the porch of her house in the late light, alone for once. The children were with Martha, Samuel and Elena were managing the evening chores, and the ranch was in the particular settled quiet of a good day coming to rest. She was looking toward the river, where the cottonwoods were full and green in their summer weight, and the water moved between them with its dark, perpetual sound. She had a cup of tea in her hand, and she had let her hair down, which she did in the evenings when the day's work was finished, and she looked, he thought, the way a person looks when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. He sat down beside her and she moved slightly toward him with the ease of long familiarity, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Nothing in particular," she said. "Everything." "Everything," he repeated. "The wheat," she said. "It's going to be a good harvest. Torres says the same. And Thomas asked me today about the surveying tools in the study, what they were for." A pause. I started explaining and I could not stop. He listened very patiently. "He takes after you," Elijah said. "He takes after both of us," she said, "which is an interesting combination." He smiled. "Clara takes after you." "Clara takes after herself," Annie said firmly, which was entirely accurate and they both knew it. "William," Elijah offered. "William," she said, with the fond softness she used for their youngest, "is an entirely original person." They sat quietly for a while. The river moved. A night bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The first stars were appearing in the east, where the sky was already deep blue against the dark line of the mesa. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "What specifically?" he said. "Any of it," she said. "All of it. The land you lost, the complications, the winter I brought Lyle's problems to your door." He thought about this sincerely because she deserved sincerity. He thought about the 1,200 acres that were now hers and not his, which had changed the shape of his operation in ways that had required adjustment. He thought about the months of legal stress and the cattle incident and the long winter of working toward a hearing whose outcome had not been guaranteed. He thought about all of it. "No," he said, "I cannot identify a single moment in any of it that I would choose to have gone differently." She looked up at him. "Not even the fence." "Maybe the fence," he allowed. "That was an inconvenient morning." She laughed, the full and transforming laugh that he had been provoking for 7 years and had still not grown the slightest bit tired of. "I don't regret it either," she said, when the laugh had settled. "I just wanted to hear you say it." "You are," he said with great affection, "occasionally very manipulative." "I prefer strategic," she said. "I know you do." She turned and looked at the river again, and then back at him. And the look was the look of 7 years of shared life and 3 children, and 100 difficult mornings, and 1,000 good evenings, and the absolute reliable bedrock of a person who was exactly what they appeared to be. No hidden motives, no dark past kept secret, no forced choice or trap, just a woman who had come back for her father's land and found something she had not been looking for and recognized it for what it was. "I love you, Elijah," she said. Not for the first time by a very large margin, but with all the weight of the first time still in it. "I love you, Annie," he said. Same weight, same meaning. The deed had been buried and he had found it and she had come with it, and neither of them had been quite the same since, and he would not have had it any other way. They sat on Thomas Atwood's porch while the stars came fully out above the Purgatoire Valley, and the river ran past in the summer dark, and the ranch was quiet and whole around them, and the land, every acre of it, hers and his and theirs, lay under the Colorado sky as it had always lain, patient and beautiful, waiting for the people who deserved it to find their way home. The winter wheat came in that autumn as thick and good as Annie had predicted. Thomas helped with the harvest and asked approximately 400 questions about the process, all of which his parents answered in turn. Clara supervised, which no one had asked her to do, but which no one successfully argued with. William was carried on Samuel Torr's shoulders for most of the afternoon, and observed everything from that height with his characteristic general goodwill. Martha made bread from the first milling of the season's grain, and everyone ate it warm from the oven with butter, and it tasted, as it always did, like something that had been grown exactly where it was supposed to be grown. Above the kitchen doorway, between 2 stones in the wall, there was a smaller stone of a slightly different color. If you knew to look for it, you could see it. If you knew what it meant, it told you the whole story. A man who had built something, a daughter who had come back for it, a man who had found a deed buried in his records and done the right thing, and all of it braided together into something that would outlast all of them, rooted deep in the Colorado earth alongside the river that never went dry. That was the story of the land. And of Annie Atwood, who became Annie Donovan, who was more than Elijah Donovan had bargained for in every way that mattered, which was to say that she was exactly what he needed, which was to say that she was everything, which was precisely enough.